Good afternoon, ex-Winterview, back again with another brief dialogue for his dear friend Annastacey. As usual, this brief dialogue is being delivered from the comfort of my car. The subject of this brief dialogue is to answer a question recently asked on YouTube. I wrote a reply to that in the comments section, but I thought I would flesh it out. A good question. Why not? The question is about seeing through or wondering about cause and effect. And it's a very hard thing to imagine, really. I mean, it's impossible to imagine, frankly. But I thought I'd give a little dialogue on this matter. Why not explore it a little bit? And I'll go through it in a stepwise manner, linearly speaking, cause and effect. It even seems that this is the effect of the question, which was the cause, perhaps. So it's very hard to see outside of that paradigm. So let's go through a few things. The first thing I always have to say is more or less the same as I say in every brief dialogue about this self. You see, there's a sense of existence in some ways, that something's here and something seems to be happening. We use these words to try and convey this existence, presence, being, consciousness, awareness, and so forth. These are all words that attempt to describe the appearance or what seems to be happening. But what is difficult to see is that even the words themselves are part of the appearance. And the other limit, which is more obvious, is that we don't know if our words in any way reflect something called reality. There's no way to know that. We don't know if the words in some way relate to something called reality. We don't even know if there is something called reality. We just don't know. That's an unknowable. But that gets into the domain of definition. And I'm going to come back to definition. I'd like to start with the first precept, you might say, is that the mind reports, or it is believed, or the body conveys a sense of one's separateness, an independent existence, that I exist separately from everything else in this world. This is a fundamental, I'm going to use the word assumption, even though it's not quite the right word for it, but let's roll with it. It's a fundamental assumption that I exist separately. Now, if that is true, if I do indeed exist separately as a person, either in this body or as this body, then logically everything else is in proximity to me, the rest of the world. And that is the birth, you could say the birth of me is also the birth of time and space. That is, if I exist separately and objects are separate from me, there is distance, space, that is, between myself and the objects, and therefore between object and object. The birth of me exists, you could say, conceptually. The idea of my independence exists as an idea, a concept, a mental thought form. The fact that I can label and objectify seeming objects around me completes the appearance that I and the objects exist in some kind of space-time matrix. If there is space between the objects, then the distance between the objects, or any movement I should say, within the space realm would necessarily involve time. One cannot be, if there was no time, then all objects would be connected because there'd be no time to go from here to there, if that makes sense. That is why space and time are linked. The idea, therefore, that I'm separate naturally implies this. If we were to, just intellectually speaking, remove the person, the apparent individual in the middle of the whole equation, then you can see suddenly that without that point of reference, I, or me, person, then looking around the world wouldn't have any point of reference. It wouldn't be me here looking out over there. There would only be everything. Just everything. I guess that's quite a hard thing to mentalize, but that's the natural, as far as I'm concerned at least, natural logical conclusion from intellectually removing that person, the I. There would only be everything, because you couldn't necessarily say anymore that there's a here and there without me being here. Have a think about that. Without you there, there'd be no here. You couldn't say here, and you couldn't say there. How could you say that? Okay. So that's point one, you could say. This person gives rise to the space-time world, you might say. Now, in this space-time world, which just apparently unfolds, without anyone seeming to do it, it seems to unfold in a linear way, in a very predictable way. And we even see science seemingly investigate this. But the problem for science is that it places itself separately, it seems at least, now this is all apparently, from the world, as if it's stepping out of the world and looking back at the world and going, how do things work? But what science fails to do, or the scientist, is bring itself into the appearance. That science is also unfolding at the same time as the world is unfolding. The problem being, as you can start to see, is that to really establish cause and effect, you have to be able to put a stake in the ground, so to speak, in the space-time realm, a point of reference to assert before and after. But if you can't do that, if space and time cannot be pegged to a point of reference, well, space and time really are a point of reference. If you can't do that, then you cannot establish cause and effect. You can't establish relationships. The best you could come up with would be more like a dream without a person dreaming it. That everything is just unfolding in one giant appearance. You could say that it unfolds linearly, you could say, and that certainly appears to be the case. But without a point of reference, you can't really establish cause. Cause, if there is such a thing, becomes infinite. Everything needs to be here for everything to be here, you might say. Or, another way to put that is, you cannot discern what parts of the appearance would be necessary and what wouldn't be necessary for a cause and effect relationship to exist. The only thing you could really tell is that everything is happening at the same time and it's all important in some way, which, once that is the case, it crushes the idea of cause and effect, because you're really saying everything causes everything, which becomes meaningless. The other thing to say is that its cause and effect in some ways are an artifact of perception as well, human perception. But another way to look at the unfolding of the appearance of life and Earth and all that is, you can say it's contextual. The contextual model is a little bit more sophisticated than the old cause and effect. You could look at conditions that are present and make guesses based on conditions. For example, you could say that in a culture, some random culture we could look at, take a microscope out and have a look at the culture. This culture is poor, perhaps. There's low GDP, low personal income. They have an unstable government. Banking systems are corrupt or very poorly regulated. There's famine, perhaps. There's strong religious ideologies, strong tribal tensions running back eons. This is a context. And within this context, you could start to predict that certain things are more likely to occur. Probability of occurrence. In this particular context, you could say that mortality rates are probably going to be higher and at an earlier age than somewhere that is more developed, more regulated, more orderly, more hygienic, and so forth. You could say that you could maybe make guesses that violence is more likely to occur. Random robberies are more likely to occur. All the unpleasant things of a culture are more likely. I won't carry that example further, but you can see suddenly that if you can look at a context, you can start to see the likelihoods of certain events become more probable. But again, you have to be able to frame a context in order to make those claims. And once again, you end up back at definition, human definition, which in some ways is just arbitrary. We just make up categories and then decide on them. Then delineate them ourselves. And so suddenly you can see cause and effect, although it might be an apparent phenomenon in a very local sense with very tight definitions. You end up with the problem of definition. That is, that it all seems to come back to some point of reference that needs to be defined in order to make the claims of cause and effect, or claims of this is the context, or this is the climate of a certain location. Once it's seen that it requires strict definition in order to make claims, then the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, becomes somewhat arbitrary. It becomes it becomes somewhat, I was going to say, just a uniquely human trait in a way. So, for example, in the YouTube comment that was mentioned, if I think the example was, I'm going from memory here, if I take a medicine, then the effect will be that the illness gets better if I'm sick, something like that, I think. A cause and effect relationship. However, first of all, you need to define you need to define it, illness, define medicine, and so forth. And to define stuff, you need to give it a discrete edge. Without a discrete edge, it's not an object. So that could be a mental edge. You physically touch it, can define it, but again, you'll find yourself coming back to language to give it a more concrete definition. Just throwing out the trash. That's not me getting out of my car as it moves. I've parked. So we end up again back in this funny place of setting strict parameters that if this person here who has this illness here as defined by this takes this medication on this particular day and 4 days later reports feeling better, and a week later a lot better, and 2 weeks later completely cured of a disease, it seemed, looking backwards, this is all conceptual of course, but looking backwards it seemed, yes, the medicine caused a change of some description in the body. But that's a very limited, you can see how limiting it is if you start to look at all the factors that were necessary for that apparent change to happen. Of course, the body has its own defense system, that some medicines don't work, and that some illnesses get some diseases heal themselves, so to speak, without any medical intervention. Medicine has a statistical rate of success or failure, depending on your leaning, and some immune systems are more robust than others. The conditions that surround the body might have been a factor. Maybe there was rest, and maybe there was improved diet, and maybe some other factor that you couldn't imagine came into play. Maybe the medicine, more than affecting the disease, led the person to believe they were getting better, and maybe beliefs have some power over our body, or maybe it's a combination of everything. And once you start going down that road, it's a combination of everything, then you're back to everything causes everything, and then it all falls down. What's the point of saying that? There's no point. It becomes meaningless again. So the cause and effect relationships require strict definition in a way. You've got to really set the parameters tightly, but then you end up with this sort of meta problem of who is doing that, and why is it even being done? Because even to set parameters even tightly requires it requires an apparent person to be doing that. But more importantly, I'd suggest that the parameter setting is also just happening automatically. Like, who's doing that? You see? And of course, once you start acknowledging that, it all falls down again. You can't get a grip on this world. Whenever you try to step back from it, it's like putting your foot on ice. It just starts to all slip away. It all slip away. And so the best description, really, at the end of the day, is that cause and effect seems to happen. It seems to be part of the appearance, or it's apparently happening, is another way of saying it. But it is, which implies that it is and it isn't at the same time. So what I've done here, hopefully in this brief dialogue, is to explain some of the isn't-ness, as well as give a taste of some of the is-ness of it. Anyway, I think that's the best I can do given the duration of this car trip, 20 minutes or so. I hope that was a little bit helpful, gave you a bit more insight into the challenges of defining the world as cause and effect, and opening the possibility that there's more going on than just cause and effect, or perhaps it's not even going on at all. Once again, thanks for listening, and as usual, your comments are very welcome.